Good morning, everyone. Today we are talking about everyone's favorite topic, parking, specifically on parking requirements. My name is Kristen Lopez. I am the Education and Training Director here at Connecticut Main Street Center. Based on our registration numbers, of course, this is a hot topic, no surprise. And we really want today to be an interactive discussion. So definitely warm up your fingers in the chat, introduce yourself, and we'll get into the discussion soon. But first, just a few words. So if you're new to Connecticut Main Street Center, we are the expert resource for developing and sustaining vibrant downtowns and main streets that fuel our state's prosperity. We all know a great downtown when we see it. It's a feeling, an energy that we can sense and experience, but sometimes it can be really hard to articulate what exactly makes a main street great. So we've broken it down into 6 qualities to make it a little bit easier to grasp. First, there's always a dedicated Main Street management model who's really driving the downtown forward and making sure all the loose ends are taken care of. The Main Street is connected by multiple modes of transportation, making it easy for people to access and to get around. It's welcoming, friendly, and inclusive. Sustainable practices are in place that bring life and vibrancy for today and for the future. Small businesses are supported and also encouraged, as well as larger commercial and residential development. And there is a unique sense of place. And so it is our mission at Connecticut Main Street Center to assess, educate, and convene around these qualities of a vibrant downtown so that main streets all around the state can develop, grow, and prosper. We are very grateful to our sponsors and funding partners that make this work possible. Connecticut Main Street's founding sponsors are Eversource and the State of Connecticut Department of Economic and Community Development. We also have additional funding coming from Webster Bank, Travelers, and Liberty Bank. And some quick housekeeping notes. Through our AICP certification maintenance provider, FHI Studio, this webinar is approved for 1 continuing credit for our planners. Just be sure to complete the evaluation form at the end of the webinar and provide your name and email address. Additionally, if you're pursuing your CCMO certificate through CCM, this webinar is approved for 1 credit. And so when you leave this webinar, you'll receive a link to take an evaluation. Please take a moment to complete it. It's really important for us to create meaningful educational programs. And with that, I am very excited to introduce our panelists. We have Mark Barnhart, the Director of Community and Economic Development from the town of Fairfield, Michael Byrne, Principal of MJB Consulting, and Alyssa Kent, the Senior Development Manager and Design Director at Spinnaker Real Estate Partners, and also Connecticut Main Street Center Board Member. Welcome, everyone. Are we all unmuted here?
Yes, hopefully you can hear me.
I think we're good. Yep. Thanks for having us.
Excellent. Thank you all for joining us. So really excited to dive into this conversation. And before we get into there, can you just introduce a little bit more about who you are and the work that you do to kind of ground our conversation? Mark, let's start with you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Mark Barnhart. I'm the Director of Community Economic Development for the town of Fairfield. I've been in this position since late 2002, so about 20 plus years with the town. Prior to that, I was the town manager for the town of Stratford for about 10 years. So very happy to be with you as part of this discussion about parking.
Mike.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Mike Byrne with MJB Consulting. We are a retail planning and real estate consultancy based in New York City and the San Francisco Bay Area. We work across the country. hired by public, nonprofit, and private sector clients to perform retail market analyses, develop retail visions, advise on land use and zoning, so on and so forth. And done quite a bit of work over the years in Connecticut, Stanford, Greenwich, Sono, Bridgeport, New Haven, Mystic, all over. So I'm excited to be here.
Thanks, Mike. And Alyssa.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Alyssa Ken, I'm with the Spinnaker Real Estate Partners. I'm an architect by training, but spent most of my career in real estate development, focused on multifamily and mixed use projects, mostly here in Connecticut, but a little bit in the tri-state area. You know, are excited to talk about the impacts of parking and parking requirements.
Excellent. Thank you. So one of the things that I love about bringing all three of you together in this panel discussion is the unique perspectives that you all bring. And it was very clear in all of our prep calls that we're talking about parking requirements, but soon, you know, parking is just kind of like this kernel of a topic, and it touches so many different important topics and kind of challenges that we see in our suburban and urban context. So let's get a little bit more into your respective perspectives. So Alyssa, if we start with you, from your development perspective, what is your take on parking requirements and how does it impact your work?
Sure. So parking requirements, you know, first of all, as a developer, we never want to have a parking problem. That's like kind of worst case scenario. But parking is a unique part of building a pro forma for development project. You know, whether it's because we're building in an area that's fully built out and we don't have access to the amount of land that we would need. Or, you know, the cost of, you know, the land cost of surface parking versus the ever rising cost of structured parking, I think is now up beyond $40,000 a space on average. And so parking requirements are something that we really hone in on because we understand the typologies that we're bringing to an area and understand how our uses in shared parking and overlapping parking really hone in on what we need for a particular project. And when those are at odds with what a town or municipality have zoned for that particular zone, you know, it becomes a problem, and then it either affects our entitlement process in terms of negotiating a relief on parking or a shared parking concept, and ultimately can make or break, you know, how a project performs in a pro forma, and whether we are able to then push that through a pre-development stage. Both on, you know, like I said, we don't like a parking problem. We want to make sure that we have sufficient parking for the needs of our developments, but then also those need to be met with either appropriate zoning requirements or some relief from parking requirements. This really comes also into play when we have multi-phase projects, understanding how parking may be phased into a 2, 3, 4 phase project that may be all on one site or a compilation of sites in an area.
Thank you. Mark, from your municipal economic development perspective, how does parking play a role in attractiveness, you know, the economic vitality of a town? What's kind of the intersection with the parking requirements?
Well, thank you for that. It is a balancing act. Obviously, you want to provide enough parking for the folks that live there, work there, may come to visit or shop at a business location, but too much of anything can be a bad thing. You know, like Alyssa, when I meet with investors, developers, businesses looking to locate here, oftentimes our conversation starts and ends with parking. Is there enough parking on site to meet our current requirements? And then looking at strategies to mitigate that if that's not the case. So it obviously plays a key role. In Fairfield, we're very fortunate in our downtown to have a very vibrant downtown with a lot of independent shops, restaurants, performing arts centers. what's ironic and what, you know, it's a walkable downtown, people love it. But what's ironic is that if we were strictly to impose our parking regulations with respect to each of those businesses or entities that are located there, many of that they wouldn't exist. So, you know, oftentimes we're trying to play a little bit of catch up to make sure that we're moderating our requirements and meeting the expectations of those that we work with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, managing expectations, I think is something that's going to come up a lot. And Mike, from your retail experience, I mean, parking, right, it's always a big thing from your perspective.
Yeah.
What are retailers looking for and consumers?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we'll talk about that throughout the next hour, but I think, you know, to speak about it more generally, to start, I think any downtown, there obviously needs to be enough of it. I mean, that's first and foremost, but most communities where I work, they actually have enough of it. It's about how that existing supply is managed or not managed. And the ways in which supply is best managed can be counterintuitive. It's a little like how the layperson, when they see lots of traffic, they say we need to add traffic lanes. And most planners know the concept of induced demand. That might work for a little while, but eventually those incentives will put more people on the road, and there you go, you have your traffic again. Well, parking is similar in that the solutions sometimes or often are counterintuitive, and no matter how much you try to explain them to lay people, they'll often default to their preconceived notions. I find that with parking, so much of one's tolerance for the inconveniences associated with it depends on that person's frame of reference, the expectations they have developed over time in the broader retail ecology within which they sit. Are they used to paying for parking? Are they used to in-front parking? Are they used to parking decks? I grew up in Westchester, and you know, I was used to going to the mall and having to pay in a garage in White Plains, right? I mean, and so I was surprised when I learned that so many people in the suburbs would say, no, there's not supposed to be any parking here that I have to put quarters in the meter for. There, I'm dating myself. So I think it depends a lot on the frame of reference. I've worked in downtowns where there is the expectation of limited parking that you're gonna have to pay for. And there, any tweaks, whether it's increasing the parking rates, meet with less resistance than towns where there's no precedent for that, and where a lot of people will push back even against time limits, let alone paid parking. It's also about making the experience of parking as painless, comfortable, and pleasant as possible. I was doing work in downtown Hyannis on the Cape, and while there were lots of complaints that we don't have enough parking, parking study after parking study showed that there was more than enough parking. What it was about partly was that the parking itself, it was such a dreary experience to go from parking lot to Main Street. And it wasn't just a matter of, you know, apps and wayfinding and direct motorists to parking lots and available spaces, but also improving the connection between what was then a vaguely rundown parking lot behind the stores through mid-block alleys to the main street with better pedestrian wayfinding, upkeep, lighting, murals, orientation maps, so on and so forth. So it's also about the extent to which you can improve that experience. So, you know, my general answer is then, you know, managing the parking supply and making this experience as painless as possible.
Yeah, and on that topic of that, there's typically kind of enough parking. There's just maybe some more issues. Mark, can you share a little bit about the recent study that Fairfield has done?
Well, not surprisingly, we found that we were overparked, especially with respect to some of our larger commercial plazas. And all due credit goes to a volunteer member of our Affordable Housing Committee. We certainly discussed an approach and provided tools to him, but he did most of the legwork, which entailed looking at our 10 largest commercial plazas, most of which are multi-tenanted, some, considerably in excess of 100,000 square feet. What was interesting is that combined, they accounted for 5,000 plus total parking spaces, over 19 acres of impervious surface. So we're talking a lot of parking, right? He did basically a time-lapse study looking at parking utilization at different times of the year over a period of several years using aerial imaging software that we had available. And it was painstaking work because he was basically counting up the number of cars that were parked at any given time and then looking at that over a period of time. And what he found, which certainly jives with anecdotal information we had, we were looking to demonstrate through data to prove or demonstrate that we did have excess parking at some of these locations. But he showed that on average, the utilization was about 36%. It ranged from 18 to 60%, depending on the commercial plaza we're talking about, but on average it was 36%. And some obviously were, very, very low, 18%, and some were closer to what we might expect. But in all cases, there was ample parking, even to accommodate peak demand. So what that suggested to us is that perhaps, at a certain point, we don't need to keep adding parking with these multi-tenanted plazas, for example. And again, too much is not a great thing. We were looking at it, or the Affordable Housing Committee was looking in the context of for opportunities to create more affordable housing. But certainly the Economic Development Commission was interested in this study because it provides additional commercial development opportunities. Even if we were not to develop it at all, but provide additional landscape buffers, that gets at the heart of maybe reducing impervious surface and providing more opportunities for groundwater recharge and the like, just reducing the flows that get into our stormwater system as a whole. So it has a lot of benefits, and we're now in the process of developing a text amendment to accomplish that.
Yeah, definitely interested to learn more about kind of what Fairfield is looking at going forward, and we'll get to that, and I think in a little bit here. But that's excellent that a study was done over a period of years' time. I had not caught that detail, so it wasn't just a 1 quarter of
Snapshot in
1
time,
year.
right.
Yeah, that it had several years of data, which is really cool. Mike, just going back to kind of a little bit about what you were saying, where it was really about kind of the experience and expectations. And so when we think about retail, right, I feel like there's two kind of audiences. You have the patrons, the consumers, but then you also have the business owners, where a lot of our Main Street managers here will say the businesses are always complaining that there's not enough parking for my consumers. Can you speak a little bit more to kind of the psychology of what's going on, and also kind of some other factors that might be kind of at play, whether that's through financing or kind of some other trends?
Yeah, obviously it's a big question. I mean, I think some of the perceptions or misconceptions that get in the way with this issue, especially in the last 10 or so years, there's been a noted increase in increased interest in downtown housing. And there's often the assumption that comes with that hey, we're going to be able to support some of the same amenities and conveniences for those residents that they have in Boston or Manhattan. Someone has to put their mute button on. Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry about that. And that, okay, if we now have 100, 200 residents, now we can support a downtown grocer. And the problem when you're talking about those sorts of conveniences, is that in most cases, what you get from a few apartment buildings is just a drop in the bucket of what those businesses need. And so the walk-in population is simply nowhere near enough to sustain those stores. There does need to be some sort of parking solution to offer. If for a downtown grocer to survive without any parking, there needs to be a threshold level of residential density that is probably not met anywhere in Connecticut. We're talking, Back Bay, Upper West Side sorts of densities. And so, especially for conveniences like grocery, like dry cleaning, there's going to have to be some attention to that issue, and that, I think, that issue, a few apartment buildings aren't enough for that walk-in traffic to reach the necessary thresholds. The second point is that these days it's not just about parking. I think a lot of people are forgetting that, especially during the pandemic, but continuing beyond it, it's also about rideshare and third-party delivery vehicles, especially for the food and beverage that dominates so much of our downtowns. The curb has become a lot more crowded and really needs to be managed differently as a result. Also, another overlooked piece of this is employees, especially as we're dealing with the labor shortage. And in some downtowns, we're also dealing with negative perceptions about public safety. There's need to consider where the employees are going to park, and where are they going to park that's not going to accentuate the labor shortage. Because if someone has to park many blocks away in a downtown which has sketchy bits to it, why not take the job on the suburban strip? So that is an element that businesses, especially food and beverage businesses, have to consider today. Finally, last point I want to make on this, and this is a general point. Planning in general likes to push the envelope on the latest, most enlightened thinking. I mean, not across the board, but in general, planning likes to push the envelope, whereas the retail ecosystem is inherently risk averse, right? They don't like to do things before there's evidence on the ground. Businesses, for instance, they don't want to locate in a zero setback downtown building until there's sufficient foot traffic. They can't afford to wait for that to materialize. They need it now. You see this a lot when there are corridor plans that try to retrofit suburban strips into walkable realms. The businesses, they won't come in the initial stages. They won't come just for the aspiration or the expectation. They need it now. And similarly, developers, especially lenders, there's a reason it's called Black Friday. That historically, that was the day when businesses, tenants, would go into the black, right? And so a lot of, especially shopping centers, have been parked for that peak demand, which is why they look empty most of the rest of the year. It's frustrating, but it does also make sense if you're the one putting up the money. And Alyssa can speak more about this, but I think the general point is that you're dealing with an industry which, for good reason, sometimes can be very risk averse. And so they might be the slowest to adapt to some of the more aspirational, enlightened thinking out there about the future of parking.
Those are some really great points. Yeah, go ahead, Lissa.
I was just going to jump in from the developer perspective. Yeah. We've had really big challenges, particularly in our urban areas where we're trying to bring in grocery stores and other amenities that are really desired in our smaller cities and even our bigger cities in Connecticut. In bridging that gap between the expectations of retailers and what we are able to provide. And so that is a real hand-wringing moment for us as developers, so much so that a project in New Haven, we self-developed a food co-op because we were unsuccessful in attracting any of the grocers in the region to opening there, despite throwing a lot of carrots at them. The parking and the access became the biggest barrier.
Yeah, and Alyssa, I want to hear more too about specifically on parking requirements and kind of the burden that they can put on smaller development projects, the role of smaller development projects, and kind of like the balance of, as Mike was saying, to create this density. We know that there's a housing crisis here in the state. If you could just speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, so in my experience, I have worked on well-capitalized projects with a variety of investors as well as bank investors. And going through the process, it sort of opened my eyes to just how cumbersome the entitlement process and funding process can be. And imagining that if I was wanting to develop a much smaller building, say, let's just say 10 units of residential and commercial in a TOD area or in an suburban infill, Main Street infill kind of project, on a less well-capitalized, investor, how challenging that would be, how long of a hold on the land, the amount of legal, billings that would be involved, and ultimately just the risk of moving through that development project in a much smaller scale. So parking is just one component of that can really hold up a project or risk it not penciling in a pro forma. That I think discourages smaller scale development. I hear, I feel like I'm pretty well tuned in on a local level, and an advocate for affordable housing and vibrant main streets. And what I hear from people is their displeasure with the type of development that we are seeing, which is larger scale, podium style, 5/2 kind of construction. And there's a reason that we're developing that and that we're seeing, a majority of our new development looks like that. It's because of the intersection of building codes, zoning codes, and then costs, both soft costs and construction hard costs. And that is the typology that those three elements coming together are producing right now, particularly in our region. If we want to see more small scale development, infill sites, novel, smaller plots, smaller development, smaller buildings, we have to be able to attract small developers that are interested in doing smaller projects. And parking certainly is one of those barriers. When we're looking at zoning codes, parking and FAR and height restrictions are the first things that we're looking at. And then, of course, there's the building code, which, lends things as well as investments. But particularly the moving through the process ultimately affects the pro forma and the capital investment. And that's why personally, I just feel that we're not seeing as much small scale development as maybe we would like to in our TOD zones and in our main streets.
Yeah, and one of the questions that we got in advance was around, great examples of suburban parking in TOD districts. And I do think that these smaller developments play a really important role of, just 4 units, or less to create that density and that walkability. And with the parking requirements and needing, kind of a seasoned person to understand variances and to, speak to the people that they need to speak to can be a barrier.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm constantly looking for someone like Mark had to do a little study in some of our towns, not necessarily on our main streets, but in our immediately adjacent. So those streets just off of our main streets, to do an analysis of, what would those streets look like with the current parking requirements that are required. I know Mystic recently put out an image of what, or a suggestion of what their downtown would look like under current parking requirements, which was vastly different than the Mystic that we all love to go to and we see tourism advertisements for. But the same could be said for those immediately adjacent zones, the zones where we may have existing 2-family, 3-family houses, may have some residual retail or the barber shop or a legal office or a dentist office, and what those areas would look like under most current zoning requirements for parking. My guess is most of them are out of compliance. So then you start to think about the dentist that wants to open a office in one of those residual downtown zones and wants to put some income on top and a couple of apartments, and what does that look like, and can they do that? And talk about a person that is, an expert in teeth and not in development. It becomes too difficult, and instead they go rent an office suite somewhere outside of the downtown, and we lose some of that vibrancy of what we expect in our downtowns.
Yeah. To the audience, please feel free to type in questions along the way and we can incorporate them into our discussion. Alyssa, you bring up a good point on kind of all these variances, and Mark, in our prep call, you had made the comment of the majority of kind of the downtown, I think you said, has a variance in terms of parking. So I'm curious as to if you can speak to more on that and kind of what you're looking for in the future of looking at your ordinances and zoning regarding parking.
Yeah, I agree with Alyssa. It is a challenge. It's certainly at a more modest scale. That's one of the things we're looking at. How do we incentivize or look to do that so-called missing middle housing opportunities to provide more modest scale residential over retail or as a mixed use, or even exclusively residential in some areas where it's more conducive to the neighborhood in which it's situated. But oftentimes, it's difficult because of the things that Alyssa mentioned, not just zoning, but land costs, other development costs. They all impact that significantly, and parking is one component of it. In our downtown, again, Fairfield's pretty fortunate to have a great, vibrant downtown with lots of great restaurants and interesting boutiques and a couple performing arts centers. But the restaurants, performing arts centers in particular, couldn't exist if we strictly imposed our parking regulations. In fact, I would say this is just off the top of my head, but 96% of those restaurants, and definitely the two performing arts venues that I'm referencing, wouldn't be in the downtown if for not granting some relief from our parking regulations through a variance. And so from a layperson's perspective, I'm not a planner, but just looking at dealing with businesses, particularly around the issue of parking and other things, when that becomes the norm, that's no longer the exception to the rule, but rather the rule itself, that you have to question whether or not you should make some revisions to your regulations to allow for what's currently there. And that's probably true for many of the folks that represent communities on this call, where you have situations that are kind of the existing non-conforming use, and whether or not you should look to make some modifications to your regulations if that's something that you want to continue to expand upon.
Mark, we all know I think on this call how hot of a topic parking can be, and how, the online chat forums and the town hall meetings can get pretty heated when we talk about moving parking. But the fact of the matter is that already variances are put in place and people are not complaining. And Mark, I know one other great example you gave was around outdoor dining. If you could just speak to that, yeah.
Yeah. So Fairfield has long permitted outdoor dining, and people love it. The restaurants love it. People love it. And then COVID hit, and the state, to its credit, was concerned with the survival of retail restaurant uses, and expanded. Gave a lot of flexibility to communities to expand outdoor dining in particular. And we did that in Fairfield. So we didn't previously. We have in our regulations, we had an allowance for outdoor dining space, 150 square feet of outdoor dining space, without providing additional off-street parking. As we went through the pandemic and we greatly expanded the footprint of those outdoor dining areas, in some cases in parking lots, actually reducing the amount of parking, there was no adverse impacts. We didn't see any issues in terms of people being able to park and visit the restaurants and the like. It didn't have any issues from a regulatory standpoint from our police and other enforcement authorities. And again, the public responded favorably to it, as did the restaurant owners themselves. So after the pandemic kind of subsided, we wanted to continue that and expand, keep what we had gone through for a couple of years, and wanted to make that a more permanent change to allow again, those expanded footprints for outdoor dining without having to provide additional parking spaces. And to Mike's point earlier, it's not that we don't have parking. It's sometimes where that parking is located and people's perceptions about it, and whether they're, it's near the place that they want to visit. We had to go through a couple iterations with that, with our Planning and Zoning Commission. Ultimately, we had to resort to a petition drive. I mean, we have the town Economic Development Office launching a petition, gathering 1,500 signatures, then gathering letters of support from area retailers, business owners, police chief, and other enforcement authorities, all in support of expanding the outdoor dining footprint. And with the help from our, I see Emmeline Harrigan on the call, so with the help of our planning and zoning staff, we were able finally to make those changes, but not without a lot of pushback, at least initially from some that were, again, from their perspective, it's not enough. And it was really, where that parking is situated.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions in the chat here, which is something that we were going to bring up, is, parking requirements and the intersection of, I'm going to use the word sustainability, but preserving our green spaces, our natural beauty, and balancing the needs of, housing, retail, kind of all of this. And in addition, I'm going to throw it in here. One of the questions that we got a couple of times in advance was around, bike lanes, right? Wanting to promote active transportation. And so removing street parking for bike lanes. And so for all the kind of panelists here, curious as to your thoughts on that, and kind of this balancing of sustainability, green spaces, and making kind of a more beautiful experience than just concrete and asphalt. Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, I like this question about parking intersectionality, because what I find is a lot of communities, yours might be one of them, they might have very stringent parking requirements, but it's not really about the parking. Really, parking is just used as a proxy or as a tool for preserving the municipality's sense of discretion with regard to other uses. So if we make a requirement for parking that's really absurd, then they always have to come to us for a variance. So then we get to retain the discretion on whether we actually like that use. But we don't say that. We say it's about parking. And I've dealt with this in a number of places, and protecting existing character, whatever that might mean, is often used as the ostensible reason. But that can be code language for a lot of things, obviously. So I'm constantly fascinated by how municipalities use parking really as a proxy for other values. But I think, we did have a rather spirited conversation in our initial discussion, the four of us, and I see there's a few questions about bike lanes, and which I know is in some places at least a third rail. One dare not speak against bike lanes, but the data is still very inconclusive on whether and to what extent bike lanes help or hurt retail. And more to the point, almost every study I've ever seen on the subject uses much larger cities than the ones that exist in Connecticut. The ones most commonly used for these sorts of studies: San Francisco, Seattle, Portland, Minneapolis. They're not using Windsor. They're not using Torrington. They're not even using Hartford, right? They're using very different cities with different demographic and psychographic profiles. And I would venture to guess that in almost all of the communities in Connecticut, at least as far as retail is concerned, I know retail is only a narrow piece of this, but at least as regard to retail is concerned, substituting bike lanes for parking is probably a net loss, especially when no one is using them. And again, that's to some degree sacrilegious to say such a thing in the planning industry when there's no such thing as an ill-advised bike lane. but I think that the data itself is at best inconclusive. And that's based on very anomalous sorts of case studies.
Melissa or Mark, do you have anything to add?
Well, I agree with Mike that, oftentimes parking, like many other things, is about control and using zoning, which is an imperfect tool to regulate use and other things. So I would say that's very much true. Certainly here. I would also say that, with regard to bike lanes, I would agree with Mike's comment that it's not good. It would not work well with our downtown Main Street, for example, and it would be, would have provoked probably a pretty significant backlash from folks that would be looking at the loss of on-street parking spaces, which is necessary if you're not going to have the off-street parking facilities for each individual property use. So that it's really about carving up your right of way and providing for that. And there's certainly opportunities for smaller suburban areas to think thoughtfully about how to provide for shared space and complete streets to allow for pedestrians and bicyclists to use those areas. It may not be, a dedicated bike lane if you don't have, the right of way that would support that, or that comes at the expense of other uses that you feel are of higher value. So that was my perspective on Mike's comments. Yeah.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me okay. The rain just started coming down. So I don't know what you guys are hearing, but I wanted to ask around kind of innovative approaches. And there was a question here around shared parking. And I know that Alyssa, you had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, shared parking is such a critical piece to this. It's unfortunate when I was very interested in Mark's study about the occupancy of some large parking lots in a town that's 95% built out or maybe even higher. And I think understanding shared parking, understand uses, surprisingly didn't change that much post-COVID. Either our assumptions around shared parking are still pretty strong. Even people with the hybrid work schedules and things like that, there's still quite a number of people leaving their homes during the day, whether it's to go somewhere else or to go to the office. So shared parking is an incredibly important concept that we embrace as developers. Not only in the concept of an open parking lot or a parking garage, and that, one person may be parking there for their apartment and a second person may park there to go to a shop or to go grocery shopping or visit a restaurant. But also just in terms of the tertiary parking that happens around the site, not on necessarily in the garage, and understanding how we use loading zones, how we can overlap loading and moving zones with Uber zones, and what those concept looks like. So it's not only the big scale of where, bulk of people that are coming to the site, but I think Mike alluded to it earlier that there's a whole separate layer to parking, which is, is loading, is move-ins, is Ubers, is Uber Eats. All of those things also need to be accounted for, and we consider those in a shared environment in addition to our standard parking spaces that we need to support the building in terms of visitors.
I think in terms of some of the approaches or innovations that we've seen from a policy perspective, and that's really what the question is still, right, Kristen? I don't want to get you out of your flow. I think an important point to raise about parking, especially as it relates to retail, is that it's not one size fits all, in the sense that when you're looking at your retail mix, consumers traditionally think differently about parking based on the category you're talking about. If you're talking conveniences, your errands, yeah, people like, in front, in and out parking, and really, if that doesn't exist, you're as a business, you're at a tremendous disadvantage. On the other hand, when a consumer is thinking about more of a destination trip purpose, maybe an afternoon of leisure, an afternoon of comparison shopping, the movies and a dinner and a movie, generally speaking, consumers are more willing to park a little further afield, maybe even in a parking deck. No one wants to park in a parking deck, but maybe even in a parking deck, and perhaps even for a fee, right? And so I think that's an important way to kind of frame some of the solutions here, because I kind of work backwards. If this is the parking that you've got, right, and the downtown's pretty built out, you're not going to change it too much, then work backwards towards what does that mean for the retail mix. Oftentimes it means it needs to be more of a destination driven retail mix rather than a convenience oriented one, which some people aren't happy to hear, because downtowns used to also be about convenience, but we're not that time anymore. And some of it is about calibrating the land use and even the zoning for different parts of your downtown to calibrate it with the businesses in that part of the downtown. If more of your parking is on one side of it, maybe that's where the zoning encourages convenience-oriented businesses, right? So thinking about it that way, and furthermore, in terms of the businesses that are sought out, maybe ones that have opened and thrived in similar sorts of settings before. They've opened in a downtown, they've thrived on a main street with similar parking constraints, and they're perhaps going to be less likely to complain about it in an ongoing sort of way. Finally, two other quick ones that I've been seeing a lot of is, or that I've been thinking a lot about, is using your parking facilities as anchors for foot traffic. We generally don't think of parking facilities in that way, but that's where people are coming and going. And for business, that creates foot traffic and potential customers. So in terms of, if you are going to build a parking facility, whether a lot or a deck, place it in a way that really promotes that foot traffic in front of your business. And finally, I've seen some success in working with bank branches. We all know bank branches are often the only uses that have their own parking lots, and historically they've been very difficult to deal with in terms of sharing those spaces, even at night. Well, bank branches are contracting, as many of you know, and even when they're not closing, they're getting smaller. So they don't need as many parking spaces as they once did. And so I've seen a little more traction in trying to work with those banks on sharing at least a few of those spaces, which could make a difference on your main street.
That's great. I think that kind of partnerships with, whether it's banks or sometimes schools, the parking lots are not being used in the evenings or on the weekends. We're getting close to the hour, and there was a couple of questions that I saw on here regarding how do we communicate, to the public about parking? What are some community engagement strategies that you guys have seen? I think both Mike and Alyssa, you've brought up some good examples around, starting with better promoting what you have. Alyssa, you brought up, I think, Mystic's, visual example, but any other kind of, best practices that you guys have seen in community engagement, or maybe something that you wish you could do, but haven't had a chance to implement yet?
Well, I do think it's very important to let people know where the parking facilities are, especially if you're trying to promote shared parking and destination type retail experiences and the like. So we do have our parking facilities listed or prominently displayed on our website, Experience Fairfield. So you know where you can park illegally for the day, if that's what you choose to do. One of the things that we have is it's both a blessing and a curse, is we do have a train station downtown, which provides a huge parking field that can accommodate folks on evenings and weekends to support our restaurants and performing arts centers and the like. But at the same time, people who, at least historically pre-COVID, before everything shut down, that wanted to avoid having to pay a fee to park to go into the city, might be tempted to park on our downtown streets. And so as a result, we have time limit parking there, which tends to, get people shuffling cars around if they're an owner of business. So one of the things that we've done to allow for owners and employees of downtown businesses to park legally for the entire day during the work week is to provide designated areas for them to do so. And there is a small fee associated with that to maintain those facilities, but it's very manageable, and we have a lot of businesses take advantage of that.
Just
In terms of,
go for it.
yes, I was just going to say, in terms of community engagement, I think there's two different types. One is what Mark is talking about, which is getting creative about your hyper local needs in terms of parking and your pinch points, and making changes to accommodate those, and also letting people know where parking is located. And then the secondary one is the people that are engaged in the parking conversation are the ones that you need some PR work around. The idea of giving some models for what the current zoning looks like if you were to build your downtown new, or your TOD district new, and I'm sure there's shared examples out there. But doing some of those graphics go a long way, I think, in terms of helping people understand what the words in text really mean, particularly when there's so much public perception around parking and traffic that may be used as kind of as an attack mechanism against change. And change is so hard, and I think you can easily identify traffic and parking as one of those things that people will flag when talking about change. But then really trying to hone in on who your audience is and how you demonstrate what you're trying to achieve, whether it's in webinars or local meetings, or just finding advocates that will put that out onto social media pages and be talking to their fellow engaged citizens on what that looks like.
Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, and one last point I wanted to make on that subject, and again, this borders on the sacrilegious, and it's probably more applicable as downtowns are as we're talking bigger and bigger downtowns, but on some level, I always think of downtowns and who gravitates to them in terms of kind of an adoption lifestyle. So adoption life cycle. You have your pioneers and your early adopters. You have your early majority, then you have your late majority, and then you have your laggards, right? And the laggards, no matter what you try to do for them, are not coming anytime soon. And parking is one of those issues where that stubbornness can be particularly acute. And in terms of, with your retail mix specifically, and what customers you try to focus on, what businesses you try to focus on, even what developers, who are those pioneers and early adopters who, yeah, they're not going to be happy with parking constraints, but it's not a deal breaker for them. The problem we often have in downtowns is that we listen to the laggards because they're the loudest, but they ain't coming until the end, if at all. And believe me, if you're successful with the earlier stages of those life cycles, that downtown will become such a buzzworthy thing. Those laggards will eventually join in, and they'll park a couple blocks away because, hell, it's the place to be. It's the sexy place to be, right? Mm-hmm. So focusing too much on the laggards and not enough on the ones who are right there in front of you, who don't necessarily need so much convincing, as a general framework for downtown adoption, I think can be useful.
I think, Mike, that's an excellent point. And I think just to kind of sum up some of the key highlights, that we talked about, I think one, parking is used as kind of a scapegoat for a lot of problems, and it's not getting to the heart of what's really going on in our downtown. And while we didn't explicitly say it, I think we all know intuitively, Connecticut, is a car-centric place. And we need to understand that. And we understand, not everyone's going to get on a bus to do everything. But there's a balance. And from all the studies that we've done, I know Fairfield has done it, I'm sure other communities across the state, there is enough parking, but there is a disconnect, whether that's marketing, communication, psychology. There's a gap there that needs to be bridged. I know we can talk so much longer about this topic, but any kind of last words from our panelists?
Well, thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel. Of course, I learned a lot as a participant here and panelist from Mike, and I think that's the good words to live by. Don't focus on the laggards.
Yeah, that is definitely some good advice.
Agreed.
Awesome.
And I thought there were some great questions in the chat, and I hope maybe there's a second part to this at some point with some additional people responding. But in general, I'm so relieved to see, I think at peak we had like 52 people on here that are engaged and interested in understanding what this means from all aspects. So thank you all.
Yeah, and I agreed. Thank you to Mark, Alyssa, and Kristen. I learned a lot from all of you, and yeah, these are some great questions. Thanks everyone for coming and listening, and I wish we had time to answer some of these, but yeah, the last thing I would say is that and we were talking about this on our initial call too. That the crux of parking is this: that people will park a block and a half away from a downtown and complain about it, but they'll gladly park as far as a quarter mile away from the mall entrance or the multiplex entrance, and then cross a really dispiriting landscape of parked cars, and not complain at all about it. So, and that really gets to the crux of the matter. This is psychology more than anything else. And that's what we're dealing with. And it's not always rational. And I think we have to know that going in, and as they say, meet people where they are, that this is psychology, and that's what we're dealing with, and that's what we have to respond to. So, as a broad sweeping statement to end things.
That's a great note to end on, and I guess we all have to go back to school and get a degree in psychology, right?
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for your time, for your panelists here, these great insights. Thank you for all the great questions. Just have a few kind of wrap up notes here. If you are not part of our Connecticut Main Street network, we invite you to join us. One of the things that has been brought up, especially Mike, some of your components around, curating a retail thing, Main Street management does that. And so having a champion, a steward that really sees your whole downtown district, can really help find the right businesses to make your downtown more of a destination where, parking becomes maybe a more mute issue, because it's a destination that people want to be in. And so we encourage all of our communities to adopt a managed Main Street approach. We have our Awards of Excellence taking place June 18th in Norwich from 2 to 5. You can register now, get your tickets. We'll be honoring our first ever graduates of our new Main Street Accelerator program, so we hope to see you there. And in July, we'll be back on our webinar schedule. We'll be going back to basics with our Main Street Management 101. So this will be perfect for those of you who aren't familiar with the Main Street Management approach or who need a refresher. And with that, again, thank you so much to our sponsors and program partners. When you exit this webinar, you'll be prompted to take an evaluation. Please take a moment to do that. And there is also a link in your chat. Take care, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Stay dry.
Thank you.